Yep. So how did you guys do with the financing addendum last week? Was it a blur? Do you understand it a little bit better now, hopefully? Yeah, yeah, that's an important one. And have a lender that you can reach out to, hopefully, with a cell phone number. Somebody who's going to help you. It's important. Oh, all right, we're going to get going this morning. Today, we are talking about inspections and inspection responses and inspection waivers and all the good stuff that goes with it. What I'm trying to cover in this basic, I call it the basic contract mastery, are the half a dozen or so forms that are the most used forms every time you guys are going to write a contract. You need to have conversations with your buyers. When you're listing a piece of property, you need to explain to your seller that these are common forms that will probably be coming in, so they're not surprised, how they work. So we've covered the purchase and sale and the addenda. How many of you guys went back and actually read the agency brochure? Because you probably hadn't read it. Good for you, Lindsay. You hadn't read it since literally you passed your test. It's a really good refresher, and you should do that every once in a while just to remember duties to the public, to your client, to the other broker, and what that entails. So Lucy, Courtney, cameras, you guys got cameras this morning? Maybe. Tammy, although Tammy, you're in the valley. I don't know that you're going to get it. No? Okay. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to watch another short video. I think watching a video from Annie on inspections is kind of a really good way to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. And it saves me going through a lot of ins and outs because she's going to kind of cover some of the highlights today. So let me get this up for you. And the first one talks about Form 35, just the inspection addendum itself. So let me make sure I've got my optimizer stuff on. Just a quick side note for you guys. If you're on Zoom and you go to share a video, when you go to screen share and the screen pops up and it shows you the different screens you can share, down at the bottom, there are a couple of check boxes. Share sound and optimized for video clips. I've learned that is the key if you're sharing a video with somebody, a client or anybody else, that you check those two boxes, and you got to check them every time. You only have to check them once. Once they're checked and you share a screen, they stay checked. So there's your Zoom tip for the day. Okay, so, oops, wait a minute. Do that one. All right, do this again. Screen 2, here we go.
Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. Following the 2021 revisions to Form 35, I've received a lot of questions. There's still some confusion out there about who is allowed to inspect buyer's property during the initial inspection period versus the additional inspection period. And the answer is super simple. There is no difference. There is literally no distinction between the initial and the additional inspection period as to who buyer may bring into seller's home to perform an inspection. The buyer is always limited, for the purpose of conducting a general home inspection, to hiring a licensed home inspector. Buyer can conduct their own inspection, setting that aside for a moment because we're talking about who the buyer can bring into the seller's home. So for the purpose of conducting the general home inspection, it has to be a licensed home inspector. In addition to a licensed home inspector, buyer can bring a specialist. The term is not defined in Form 35. Look in the dictionary for the definition of specialist. I'm not being facetious. if a court is interpreting a contract, a court will give the usual and normal meaning to a word unless the word is defined in the contract. The word specialist is not defined in the Form 35 or anywhere else in the purchase and sale agreement, so you're going to use a dictionary definition to come up with the meaning of that word. We all know essentially what a specialist is. So if the buyer needs to bring a roofing contractor, it should be a licensed and bonded roofing contractor, but the buyer has the right to bring that roofing contractor onto seller's property during either the initial or the additional inspection period. No requirement for the inspector to give a recommendation for a roofing contractor to inspect the roof before the buyer has a right to bring that roofing contractor on the property. Same thing is true with a mold abatement contractor, with a general contractor who's going to give a bid to fix a rotten floor, with respect to a pest inspector or pest remediation company. Whatever the specialist, whoever the specialist might be, the buyer has the right, based on the permission given by seller through the Form 35, to bring that specialist onto seller's property during the initial or the additional inspection time period. In the Form 35, there is no limit on the number of inspections that buyer can have of seller's property. Buyer brokers, be reasonable. When the buyer goes to ask the seller for concessions based on the results of their inspection, you're not going to get anywhere if the buyer has so angered the seller through their haphazard approach to inspecting seller's property, disrespectful of seller's time and property by not scheduling inspections in an efficient manner, by not trying to coordinate inspections as much as possible. Buyer brokers, if your buyer is disrespectful of the seller in their home, that's not going to help your buyer in future negotiations regarding concessions. So when I say there's no limit as to the number or the variety of inspections buyer can have, that's a true statement. There's no limit in the contract. Common sense hopefully imposes some limits and creates a requirement for efficiency. So with all of that said, what is the purpose of the additional inspection time? The purpose of the additional inspection time is just that. It's time. It's time for buyer to do more inspections if the initial inspection period is not sufficient time to complete the inspections buyer needs to do in order to satisfy buyer's requirement for due diligence. Buyer will trigger the additional inspection time as described on the Form 35 by delivering to seller the Form 35R with the appropriate box marked, attaching a copy of the recommendation only the words that form the recommendation from buyer's general home inspector recommending the additional inspection. With that, buyer triggers the additional inspection time. Again, the only distinction between initial inspection and additional inspection is time alone. If you have questions on this topic or any other.
We kind of jumped into the middle. And I'm still going to go through the form, obviously the inspection form and the additional inspection time frame that you're going to have. So the contract defaults, and we'll go through this, to 10 days for your initial inspection. And it defaults to an additional 5 days for additional inspections. For example, you get an inspection done and they recommend that you have a roofer go out and inspect the roof to make sure that there's not a problem with the sag in the roof or it's covered in moss. The form, the way it's written, gives you an automatic extra 5 days to get a roofer out. And by the way, that is the buyer broker or the buyer's responsibility to find someone who can go out, give you an opinion of the condition of the roof in this example, and also hopefully give you a bid for remediation. That is not necessarily on the listing broker. You may or may not want to involve them in what's going on. That's really up to you. So, quick question for you. The initial 10 days that we have, this is basic, I'm going to pound it into your head. The initial 10 days for your inspection by default are what kind of days? Throw it out there. Hold down your space bar and answer me. Gavin.
Calendar days.
Oh, you already got it, Sierra. calendar days. All right. So the 5 days or more are what kind of days?
Business,
And they do not include, Jody?
weekends and holidays.
Perfect. Awesome. Or whoever was talking. I think that was Jody. That was you. Thank you. Doesn't include weekends and holidays. How do you know if a holiday is going to count for your computation of time? Let me give you a hint. Only Washington state recognized holidays, which most federal holidays are. I personally just go to my friend Google and put in Washington State holidays 2022, and they will come up. Those are the days that you will use. And usually the Northwest Multiple sends out a reminder that for the computation of time, you're not going to be using a certain day. So the next holiday that we have coming up is Labor Day weekend. Labor Day weekend. So Labor Day falls on a Monday. We actually had a deal the other day, and I was reviewing it for a new broker, and he had closing on Monday, September, whatever it was, that Monday, Labor Day. By default, if you do that, it's going to roll over to the next business day. However, it's a rookie mistake to schedule a closing on a weekend or holiday. Welcome back. Aloha, Tessa Jarvis.
Aloha, welcome back.
What you got?
Oh, just a pop quiz. Can my inspection, like my inspection contingency period, can that end on a Saturday?
That's a good question. Let's throw it out there.
Well, I know the answer. I know the answer. I'm just asking, can it end on a Saturday?
So, anybody want to take a stab? A yes or a no? Anybody? This is an inspection, so you got a 10-day inspection, calendar days, and it ends yesterday on a Sunday. Do you have to give your reply by then? Because this is a common, well, I guess I would say issue that other brokers in the field that you may have to educate don't always know. All right, Tessa, go ahead. You get your brownie for the day. Tell us what the answer is.
No, it cannot end on a Saturday. So if we were thinking of Labor Day, if that 10 days ended on a Saturday, your inspection contingency would actually fall to the following Tuesday that your reply would be due, because it can't end on a weekend or a holiday.
Okay, bonus points. What's the only exception to the rule of the time frame ending on a weekend? Bonus points, Tessa, go.
Oh, possession.
Yeah. Possession is the only thing. So if you say closing is on Friday and possession is 1 day plus 1 day, that would be Saturday. The only exception to the rule is possession as far as ending on a weekend or holiday. And the reasoning behind that is because most people, a lot of times you will see written in closing plus 3 or closing plus a week or closing plus 10 or closing plus 30. The attorneys that drafted these forms recognize that most people, when they say closing plus 3, which is common, that gives the seller a little extra time to get packed and get out, they meant it to be that if it ends on a Saturday, that the seller will be out on a Saturday. All right, one other pop quiz. What time does the buyer get possession on that possession date unless it's otherwise recognized in the contract? What time?
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. Good job, Lucy. 9 o'clock. So if the seller is planning on being out early on Saturday and your buyers have a U-Haul van parked in the driveway, it's very important that you go in and modify that possession time from 9 p.m. to something mutually agreed upon by the buyer and the seller and have both parties initial it. You can do that, but most people forget. And so legally, if you have the keys and you're the buyer broker, it is not legal for you to hand those keys over to the buyer prior to 9 p.m. on the date of possession, which kind of creates an issue. I mean, you're out with your buddies on Saturday night. You don't really want to drop everything at 8:30 and run over to your buyer's house and give them the keys. So why not make it a more mutually agreed upon time? So the seller says, yeah, I should be able to get out of there by 3 o'clock. Great, let's make possession 4 o'clock. That'll give you a little extra time to get it clean, to do whatever, right? So there's some little tips. Those are just basic contract rules. Again, most people in this industry don't know that. And so you may have to go and educate them. Hold on here. I'm going to shut this one down. All right. Moving along. I am going to go to the forms and we're going to get going on this, and I'm going to show another video here in a minute. Here we go with the screen share. And we're jumping right into the Form 35, Inspection Addendum to Purchase and Sale Agreement. Why do people get an inspection? They may get an inspection because it's an older home and they want to know if there's problems with the wiring or the roof or the structural or the foundation. It may be because it's brand new construction. It's never been lived in. You might go, why in the world would you have an inspection done on a house that's brand new? Because it creates almost a punch list for your buyer to talk to the builder about little things that they may not have found until they actually moved in and start living in the house. I've seen reverse polarity on electrical outlets. I've seen dryer vents that were not actually hooked up, and so they vented to nowhere. Little things like that a licensed contractor going through a house is going to create a punch list, and they're going to check all the appliances. They're going to check the electrical. They're going to check and make sure that the water's hooked up, the bathtub works, the toilet flushes, and that all of those little finished details that your buyer, because they don't normally buy new construction, and frankly, you don't either, you may miss it. So it's always a good idea, in my opinion, to use an inspection addendum. Now, the caveat with using a inspection addendum as a quote punch list for new construction is in the inspection addendum, it gives the buyer the right to frankly walk away from the contract. It's a get out of jail free card if they, for any reason, don't like the results of the inspection addendum. Well, let's say you've been under contract for 3 months on a new build and it's finally gotten its certificate of occupancy, and you get your inspector over there to do a punch list. How excited do you think the builder's going to be about having an inspection addendum where that buyer can pretty much walk away and get their earnest money back at the 11th hour? They're not going to be excited about that at all. So that opportunity is most likely going to be struck from the inspection addendum, the ability to cancel the contract and get their earnest money back, but it will give them the right to go ahead and do an inspection on the home. A lot of times the builder's there. They create a punch list right along with you. Okay, let's move over. Inspection addendum. Feel free to jump in at any time. I can't see you guys on the screen and I can't see the chat box. So if somebody puts something in there, if somebody else could bring it to my attention, that would be great. So the important word on this, the agreement's conditioned on the buyer's subjective satisfaction. What does that mean? That means that it's completely up to the buyer. If they change their mind for any reason, they can use this inspection addendum to pretty much cancel the contract. And it doesn't necessarily have to be done with an inspection. Buyer's inspection may include at the buyer's option and without limit. This is what Annie was talking about. You can get any kind of inspection on a property that you want. They talk about structural, mechanical, general condition, compliance, building, zoning codes, hazardous materials, pest inspection, soil stability. It must, here's the trigger. It must be performed either by the buyer or a person licensed in the state of Washington under RCW 18.28, which is just a licensed home inspector, which most of them are. They can engage specialists to conduct further inspections. And they can also, by default, they have the right to do a sewer inspection on the property, which is called a sewer scope. So by default, the buyer's inspection may include an inspection of the sewer system. We've talked about this a little bit before. Why would you have a sewer scope done? Maybe the property is an older property in an older part of Anacortes or an older part of Bellingham up on South Hill. And frankly, over time, those sewer lines, sewer pipes, they get tangled up with tree roots, they collapse under pressure, and it's very expensive, and it's the homeowner's responsibility to replace that sewer line if it breaks out to the street. The city is only responsible for the street out. The homeowner is responsible from the street in. So if you have a break in a sewer line and it's 4 feet long and it's right in the middle, you may have to dig up 20 feet of sewer line, and trust me, it's not inexpensive. Getting a sewer inspection is really easy. It's very inexpensive. I want to say, I think they're about $300, if that. If it's in a new development, there's probably not a need for it. If it's in an older part of town, there very well may be a need for it, but it's a conversation to have with your buyer. So the inspections need to be ordered by the buyer. I'm going to stop there for a second. So you have an out-of-town buyer who says, oh, Gavin, I just want you to take care of it for me. I want you to just go ahead and call the inspector and set it up. What's the problem with that? Well, I'm going to make it really easy for you, because if you order it, that means you're responsible for payment of it. And what if that buyer disappears into the sunset? What if that buyer changes their mind and doesn't want to buy this house anymore? How willing do you think they're going to be to pay for that inspection? And inspections are not inexpensive. They're hundreds of dollars. So it's always a good idea to give your buyer a list of at least 3 home inspectors and say, here's 3 that we've had great success with in the past, or you can simply go to the yellow pages and pick one yourself. Just make sure they're licensed and bonded. I'm happy to work with them. And when you order it, they're probably going to want your credit card number. Just giving you a heads up. Always have the buyer order the inspection.
I think I can jump in too really quick, Lori. I think also a better reason, or my favorite reason to have the buyer order it, is that if something goes wrong down the road, it's not coming back to me and my buyer saying, well, you picked that inspector, your inspector that you picked and ordered missed this. I want them to pick it, and I want them to call, and I want them to order it, because I don't want it to come back on me that whatever was missed.
And that's a really good point, because home inspectors are human. And I've actually been involved in lawsuits where home inspectors have missed material issues with the property, and they get sued right along with us. So if we are responsible for hiring that home inspector, that doesn't give any help to spreading out the potential liability for a faulty home inspection. Most home inspectors do have insurance, errors and omissions, just like we do, but that's a really good question to ask anybody that you're recommending. Do you have E&O insurance that would cover you in the event of a claim? Interestingly enough, the suit that we were involved in had to do with a water leak of a plumbing pipe that went down the inside of a wall. And the home inspector actually called it out. They got a moisture meter out, they put it on the wall, they'd seen staining, and they said to the home buyer, there's evidence of moisture inside this wall. I very much recommend that you get additional inspections. We were representing the seller. The buyer took that as an opportunity not to do additional inspections. They blew it off, but they used it as an opportunity to negotiate a $10,000 price reduction in lieu of any further investigation to the moisture in the wall. Deal closes, they move in. Next thing I know, we're getting served papers because this buyer and their entire family are claiming that they are having issues from breathing in mold. And the mold was a result of the leaking pipe inside the wall. Backing up a step, there had been a water leak in the property. The seller had known about it. The seller filed an insurance claim. It had been corrected, they thought, by a licensed plumber. She disclosed it on the Form 17. So the buyer had notice all over the place, chose not to investigate any further, took a $10,000 price reduction and said, going on my merry way. Next thing I know, we get a claim that both the husband and the wife and their 3 kids are having issues from breathing in mold, which can be really toxic, that they had to move out of the house is going to be condemned, and it's all our fault. And the seller knew about it and didn't report it. The interesting thing was they didn't sue their own agent. I think they may have ultimately. We went to court and we were dismissed. We, being RE/MAX, was dismissed on what we call a summary judgment, which means the court found that we had absolutely no liability in this particular case. It didn't even go to a trial. It didn't even go to depositions. It's simply the judge said, nope. And you know why? Here's why. The judge said the buyer was not only given a heads up that there was an issue with water in the wall, but the buyer had an opportunity to do further inspection and chose not to do it. They chose to take a $10,000 price reduction in lieu of doing further inspection. Therefore, they were given an opportunity. This is kind of what we call buyer beware in the state of Washington. So if the buyer is given notice on a home inspection of a potential issue, it's at least your responsibility to call that out, talk to them about what they would like to do, see if they would like to get an additional inspector out there. And what's the easiest way to prove that you actually had that conversation? Send a follow-up email. Dear Mr. Buyer, per our conversation on the phone, we discussed the sagging roof, we discussed the moisture in the wall, and we discussed the foundation issue. At this point, you have opted to take a $15,000 price reduction in lieu of any inspections. Please confirm. So you sending a follow-up email, blind copying yourself, throwing it in the file is proof that you had a conversation with the buyer and they chose to ignore your recommendation. That's called CYA in this business. Because trust me, going through a lawsuit is no fun. I have a way of saying that anybody with a quarter to call an attorney, there are more attorneys out there than there are real estate agents, and there's a lot of hungry ones. So always have a conversation with things on the inspection with your buyer. Don't just assume. If they choose to take a price reduction in lieu of, that's great, that's fine. But they need to know they may be giving up some rights to claim if there's further damage in there that you were aware of. I love to tell stories. And that one's a true one. So buyer is responsible for interviewing and selecting the inspectors. Buyer shall restore the property and all improvements to the same condition, and they're responsible for any damages. So when they do a sewer scope, they actually pull the toilet up out of the bathroom. They're responsible for putting it back. Trish, are you waving at me? Yeah.
Can you screen share?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you. Here we go. Here we go. Buyer's obligations. This is what I just covered. And that they're responsible. So, buyer's notice, time frame. This is one that you need pounded into your head. Do not miss this time frame. The inspection shall be conclusively deemed waived. In other words, your buyer gives up their rights to make any claim on any potential issues on the home if you, as their broker, miss the agreed upon time frame to reply to this. So it defaults to 10 days, conclusively deemed waived. Seller shall not be obligated to make any repairs or modifications. And trust me, I've seen some really, really expensive, like read $25,000. The buyer was going to go back and ask for either a price adjustment or they were going to have the seller do some major work. And I've seen the selling broker miss a deadline. What happens at 9:01 on day 10? At 9:01 on day 10, the buyer waives and the seller's not obligated to do anything. Guess who that buyer comes back looking for? Well, you, my buyer broker, who was supposed to be taking care of me, you're supposed to be up on these timelines and you are responsible. Then what happens? Basically, that broker ended up working for free, giving up their commission to that buyer. It was a very expensive mistake. So after mutual agreement, so that's your initial inspection agreement, buyer gives notice. They're either going to do one of, I think it's 4 things. They're either going to improve the inspection and waive. So in other words, everything looks great. We love it. We're going to move on. We don't need the seller to do anything. Or here's the one where you can kill the contract. This is your get out of jail free. Disapprove the inspection and terminate the agreement. Do they have to provide a copy of the inspection? No. Do they even have to have done an inspection? This one will surprise you. The answer is no. C, that the buyer will conduct additional inspections. Okay, we've had our inspection done. We need to get some more people in here to do some further investigation, or proposing repairs to the property or modifications to the agreement. What's a modification? A price adjustment. It's usually a price adjustment or a credit to the buyer in the form of, a buyer credit at closing to be used towards closing costs or whatever. So if the buyer disapproves and terminates, earnest money is refunded. If buyer proposes repairs or modifications to the agreement, including adjustments to the price or credits are repaired to be performed after closing, parties shall negotiate as set forth in paragraph 6 below. We'll get to that in a minute, but basically the rule of inspections is the 35R, the inspection response, does not repeat. You get one bite at the apple, you go through it one time, you can't go through it and say, oh, we're to step 3 and we're still negotiating, so we're going to go back and start over at step 1. It doesn't work that way. Inspection report. This is critical, and this has gotten some people in hot water. Buyer shall not provide the inspection report or portions of the report to the seller unless the seller requests otherwise or as required by paragraph 5, which is if you're going to ask the seller to do some corrections to the property. If you provide and they're saying buyer, but who's going to provide it? It's going to be you as a buyer broker. If you provide any portion of that inspection without seller's prior consent or as required by paragraph 5, which is cutting out and pasting the exact portion that the seller or the inspector is calling out, then the inspection contingency is waived. So if you have a big laundry list of things that you want the seller to correct, and you think to be really helpful, you're just going to attach the entire inspection to your inspection request and send it off to the seller. Don't ever, 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 ever do that, because if you do, you basically waive the buyer's rights to negotiate any further under this inspection report. And again, guess who they're going to come back to? Here's where there's also a form for this. Seller's consent. So if the seller wants part of the inspection report, all or part of it, maybe the transaction isn't going to close. Maybe your buyer says, oh my God, there's too much work to be done here. I'm out. And the seller says, you know what, it'd be really helpful though if you gave me a copy of that inspection report, because I'd like to do some repairs before I put it back on the market. That's an example. Or if the buyer requests repairs or modifications to the agreement. So they're asking the seller to put on a new roof. Seller requests that buyer provide to seller only the portions of the inspection report related to the requested repairs or modifications to the agreement. How do you do that? You literally do a cut and paste. So you will get an email copy of the inspection report. You will go through to the appropriate page where the inspector is pointing out that you should have an additional inspection done on the roof. You are simply going to cut and paste out of the inspection report that part. You're going to attach it to your request, your 35R, and send it over to the seller. That is the only exception to sending any or all of the inspection report to the seller. Super important. So now we've covered 2 ways that by making a mistake, you can actually waive your buyer's rights under this inspection and take away their ability to negotiate repairs or any kind of a price adjustment or concession. So you need to be really, really careful. Additional time for inspections. So if the inspector recommends, buyer gets additional time to do further evaluation, maybe it's going to take you another 3 days to get a roofer out there. I'm going to stick with that one. So this will be at the buyer's option and expense, and it will be on or before the end of the initial inspection period, and the buyer provides the seller a copy of the inspector's recommendation and notice that the buyer will seek additional inspections. So if they do that, the buyer gets an extra 5 days after giving notice to obtain additional inspections. So I'm going to stop here for a second and remind me to share again when we're going back to this. So let's say we go with the default time frame on this inspection. You get 10 days for the inspection, you get 5 days for the additional inspection. Contractors are in great demand right now, and they're hard sometimes to get out to a property, especially if the property is remote or a little bit out of town. And you may have to call around to get a roofer to go out and do your roof certification for you. So if you have your inspection done, let's say on day 3 of your 10-day, and on the afternoon of day 3, you get the inspection report back and it calls for an additional roof inspection. When would you deliver the notice that you need additional inspections triggering the additional 5 days? Well, if you trigger it on day 3 when you find out about it, you just throw away 7 extra days, because the additional 5 days starts on the date of the notice for additional repairs. So day 1, you go under contract. Day 3, you get your inspection. The afternoon of day 3, you get your inspection report back. You get on the phone and you start looking for a roofer. And if you're kind of again, rookie mistake, you would deliver a notice of additional time frame on day 3. So effectively, that only gives you a total of 8 days to get a roofer out there, maybe 2 roofers, get bids, try and figure out your strategy for negotiate. That is not a lot of time. The smarter strategy would be to wait until day 10, right? So you've got 7 extra days during your inspection period to go out and run around and find additional people to do bids. Plus you get an additional 5 days which are what kind of days? 5 days. What kind of days? Come on, Danny.
Business days.
Atta girl. So really, 10 days plus 10 calendar days plus 5 business days. And remembering that your 10 days can't end on a weekend or holiday can literally turn into a 3-week time period, giving you plenty of time to get an inspector out there. Now, if you don't need that much time, don't take that much time. But if it's an older house and the buyers have a lot of concerns and they want to get a lot of bids, we had one the other day. We needed a structural engineer for the roof. We needed a foundations person to go out and give us a certification for that. I mean, there was a lot of pretty major issues that had to be done. It's not easy to line all those people up. And again, usually that falls on you. So one strategy is to wait until the initial period is up or almost up. Don't miss your timeline, right? Day 10, and then trigger your additional 5 days. Your trigger for additional 5 days is simply a notice, which means that only one party's signature is required. That would be the buyer's. So the buyer is giving the seller notice of an additional 5 days that they're going to need. So you go your 10 days, and then on day 10 or right thereabout, you give them a notice of an additional 5 days. The seller can't say, no, you don't get an additional 5 days because they've already signed off on this Form 35, which is in your inspection. They agreed to it in advance. So there's no argument. There's no negotiating. This is simply a notice to the seller that you're triggering your extra 5 days. So you can see timeframes get super important in this particular addendum. And strategies. Now, flip side. Let's say that the inspection comes back great. They're just asking for something really minor. You've already had a contractor out of the house. You may want to move forward. You've got a short closing date. Then don't wait your 10 days. This is kind of a common sense strategy. Again, talk to your broker, talk to your team lead about some strategies on timeframes on that. But that's something that the buyer is going to say to you. What do you think, Sierra? What? Yeah, what do you think I ought to do? Go ahead.
I'm playing tug of war with my dog on my chair, so he's kind of noisy. I was just saying, I think it's really helpful to strategize to keep all of that time, especially with the contractors being so difficult to schedule sometimes.
You have to be using I use an electronic calendar that syncs with my phone. And I set reminders for everything I do. And I don't just set them 15 minutes in advance. If I have an important deadline coming up, I will set it 24 hours in advance or 12 hours in advance. The other thing you should be doing is creating a calendar template with all of these deadlines on them, having a discussion with your buyer and giving it to them. As soon as you go under mutual, give them a calendar that has inspection deadline, a request for additional repair deadline, 5 days to make your financing application deadline, 21 days to get your financing approval deadline. All of these things, if they're on a nice Word calendar or whatever you want to use, and you give it to your buyer and you've got one as well, and you're setting reminders, then they're not surprised, or God forbid, they're out of town camping up at Baker Lake where there's no cell reception on day 10 of your inspection and you can't get a hold of them. So it's that conversation you need to have in advance with people to just kind of let them know. So buyer's request for repairs or modifications. So if the buyer comes back and makes repairs anytime during that initial 10 days or even the additional 5 days that you get, the seller has 3 days. Wait a minute. I know, I'm doing it. Here we go. All right. Seller's response. So seller has 3 days, again, business days, after receipt of the buyer's request for repairs or modifications. Modification might be a price adjustment, to give notice that they either A, agree, and life is great, we move on, or B, agree to, well, I'll do this, this, and this, but not that, that, and that. Or I will drop my price 10,000, but not 15,000. Or 3, they reject everything. They just say, pound sand, you know what, I'm not doing a darn thing. And in a lot of cases, they may have a backup offer for more money, and they just simply want you out of the picture. Or they might offer a different or additional repairs or modifications. They might come up with their own suggestions. So if they agree to the terms, item number 1, Then everything's satisfied. Buyer's reply isn't necessary. We just go through 1 and 2 on the 35R, the inspection response, and we're done. If they don't agree, then the buyer has the opportunity to reply. Now we're going back and forth. Buyer makes the request. Seller has 3 days to reply. Back to the buyer. If the seller doesn't agree to all or part, the buyer then gets 3 days, calendar days. So you can see we've had 10 days for inspection, 5 days for additional, deliver your notice. Seller has 3 days, calendar days. Buyer has 3 days, calendar days. Good Lord, you might be out 3 weeks going back and forth on this. So watch your timelines. So 3 days from the time either the buyer receives a seller response, seller comes back and says, nope, I'll only do this, this, and this. Or what if the seller remains silent, doesn't give you an answer at all? Because sometimes that happens. That is just like they had responded that they did not agree to anything. So if seller fails to timely respond, the day of the seller's response period ends whichever's earlier. So that's if they do nothing, the end of the 3 days is like they denied everything. They can either accept the seller's response, this is the buyer, at which time the contingency is satisfied. They can agree with the seller on other remedies, or they can disapprove the inspection and terminate the agreement. A lot of people think that if the buyer comes back and requests certain modifications or repairs, once they submit that request to the seller, that they can change their mind and simply walk away from the contract. And that is not true. Once the buyer requests a modification or repair from the seller, they have to sit tight and they cannot walk away until either the time frame is up from the seller or they get an answer from the seller. So once they're locked and loaded, once they make that request, sometimes they'll go in and they'll say, you know what, I want a $10,000 price adjustment for this, this, and this. You submit that request on a 35R, and the next day they come back and they go, yeah, you know, we were thinking about it. We got another bid and we'd really like to go to $15,000. You cannot do that. Once you submit a request, you are locked in. This one's really important to cover with your buyer. Please cover this with your buyer. The timeframes for negotiating shall not repeat. That's what I mean by the 1, 2, 3 done. Parties must either reach a written agreement or the buyer must terminate by the buyer reply deadline, that final 3 days, or buyer's inaction, they do nothing during the reply period. Again, here's number 3. Once again, you end up waiving your buyer's inspection. Time frame, in which case seller's not obligated to do anything. And it's deemed waived. Don't miss your timelines. If the seller agrees to make repairs, they all should be accomplished at the seller's expense in a commercially reasonable manner in accordance with applicable laws 3 days prior to closing. Always important to do a final walkthrough, and it's a good idea to get the same inspector out there for your final walkthrough or your final inspection that did the initial inspection, because they're the ones who called things out in the beginning, and then they can give you an idea if they've been done. And that's where down here it talks about if the buyer elects to order and pay for a reinspection. It's always a good idea, and if nothing else, you should have a conversation with your buyer about it. So, if buyer agrees to pay for any repairs, this is common like on a VA deal, maybe. And there's some repairs that need to be done. The buyer is not supposed to be doing any repairs prior to closing, or it's a liability to actually set foot on the property. But sometimes they choose to do it and everybody agrees it's the only way it's going to get done. Here's your CYA, your advice to talk to an attorney to review the terms if you go through that. Oil storage tanks. A lot of older homes still have oil storage tanks. Some are functioning, most are not. Most are just sitting there underground. But if you've got them, then that's an additional inspection to actually have it inspected. And the easiest way to decommission is to either they'll fill it with a slurry or fill it with sand, or you can actually have it removed. What are they testing for? They're taking core samples of the soil around the buried oil storage tank, which for whatever reason are usually in the most inconvenient positions, like under a patio or under a garage. But they're going to take core samples of the soil and they're going to see if there's been any leakage. Because if you've got leakage from an old oil storage tank, now you're talking environmental. Now you're talking about a lot of money. I know of one here in Bellingham out on Eldridge, and the cleanup of the contaminated soil ran somewhere around $250,000. So if you've got an oil storage tank, you may not know it. The listing broker may not know it. The seller may not even know it. Hopefully your inspector is going to find it. Heads up, if you see an old oil furnace in the basement, look for the oil storage tank. On-site sewer, we're going to talk about that. That's actually septic. Neighborhood review contingency. Here's another get out of jail free card if it's checked. That the buyer's inspection includes their, well, here's that word again, subjective satisfaction. The conditions of the property are consistent with the buyer's intended use, and it can include anything. Usually it's something like, what school district is this in? How far is it from the bus line? But any of these things, traffic patterns, noise, parking, investigation, is there sex offenders in the neighborhood? Environmental safety, is it by an old concrete plant that's spewing out whatever, smoke? So they've got, if buyer does not give notice of disapproval, and this is only a 3-dayer, but this, if the buyer truly has concerns and maybe they're buying a home in a school district and they want to be able to find out if they can drive their kids to a different school district and get them in there, this may be something that you want to talk about. Although, frankly, it can run concurrently with the inspection, and the inspection, as you recall, you can get out for just about any reason. I have now covered the inspection. I'm going to cover one more really quickly. This is called a 35W. Let's say you have a buyer. They're planning on tearing the house down or doing a total gut job. They really don't care what that inspection looks like, or they really, really want the house. They're prepared to waive that inspection. That is a risk. And what is the best way of covering everybody's butts on this is to have them sign what's called an inspection waiver addendum. This is a written acknowledgement that the buyer's been advised to obtain inspections on the property, and it talks about all the different kinds, and that they've elected to waive those inspections, and then they haven't relied on any representations, whatever. So if your buyer is waiving an inspection, don't just not include a 35, actually use the inspection waiver addendum. The other option is to have what's called a pre-inspection done. What's a pre-inspection? A pre-inspection is when a buyer opts to have an inspection done prior to making an offer on the property, so they feel comfortable going in without an inspection addendum because they've already had one done. That means that you time block the time, you line up an inspector at the buyer's request. The buyer, remember, is going to have to pay for this inspection. You get permission from the seller. That is actually, maybe I didn't pull it up. Oh, here it is. That is called a 35P, or a pre-inspection agreement. You have to get written approval from the seller in order to do a pre-inspection. So you not only have to line up the inspector, make sure the buyer is available, but you also have to reach out to the listing broker and make sure that you have permission from the seller to do this. And we'll return to that in a minute. So back to the waiver. So if they waive it all together and they've never had a pre-inspection done, if they've done a pre-inspection is option 2, they've done a pre-inspection prior to mutual acceptance, and they've inspected everything to their heart's desire, and they're comfortable going in without an inspection. So the difference between the two is one never had an inspection done, the other one, the inspection was done and the buyers are satisfied with, or maybe they're not satisfied, but at least they know what they're getting into, right? And you can go into actual modifications or repair requests right along with your initial offer based on the buyer's pre-inspection. Seller shall make the following modifications or repairs described below or in the following pages. So this would be submitted. So you would check this box, this box. You're making your request right here. Modification shall be accomplished at the seller's expense, commercially reasonable manner, in accordance with no fewer than 3 days prior to closing. Just a side note, you might want to change that to 5 days. And the reason I say that is because it will give your buyer an opportunity if the seller hasn't completed the repairs or modifications they agreed to, and that does happen. It gives you an opportunity to go back, go to the seller, say, hey, this wasn't completed the way we wanted it to be completed. You need to go back in and correct this, this, and this. Just a thought, remember, all of these timeframes are negotiable. They're default to 3. You may want to do more. In the case of hazardous materials, that's that oil tank we talked about. Repair means either removal or treatment, including but not limited to a seller's option. Buyer doesn't get to pick. This is at the seller's option. Decommissioning any oil tanks. Why would they pick decommissioning over removal? It's less expensive. So decommissioning a tank, I'm going to say, is going to run you usually around $1,700, $2,200, depends. Removal is going to run you a little bit more. So seller's repairs are subject to re-inspection and approval prior to closing by the inspector who recommended the modifications or repairs, or if the buyer elects to order and pay for such a reinspection. That's what we were talking about. If the buyer wants to pay to get that original inspector back out there, then they certainly are able to do so. And then again, we're going back into the septic. So we've covered the inspection addendum, the 35, and we've covered the inspection waiver. The inspection waiver is it's a relatively new form. It just came out a little over a year ago, March of last year. It used to be incorporated with the inspection, and a lot of people just blew past it because they were using the inspection addendum to waive their inspection, and a lot of sellers never got to page 2. So they made it its own standalone form. So just remember, if you have a buyer who wants to waive and or a buyer who has done a pre-inspection in advance, this is the form you're going to include with your purchase agreement when you make your offer. I'm going to stop and catch my breath here for a second. Any questions on that before I go on to the reply? Everybody getting it? Morning, Jim Skurjank. You could teach this class, dude. Yeah, 30 years in the business and he's still coming to school. So inspection waivers and inspection addendums, we've covered that. Anybody comments, anything?
That's because I'm dumber than most.
You are not dumber. You are smarter than smart. Okay. I'm going to, while we're at this, I'm going to finish up and do the pre-inspection addendum. I'm going to cover that really quickly here. So let me screen share. Here we go. So, let's say that this is a really hot property. It's deliberately been underpriced. Your buyers absolutely love it, but there's going to be a bunch of other offers. So you want to go in and make your offer as clean as you can. But maybe you've got first-time home buyers and they just don't have a lot of money to do a bunch of repairs. They need to know what the issues are with this property prior to making an offer. So what's the solution? They're going to spend a few $100s and they're going to have a pre-inspection done by the same inspector who would do their full-blown inspection. Maybe they're just concerned about a couple items. Maybe they want the full-blown inspection done, but it's going to cost them some money. In the heat of the market, when it was crazy and bidding wars were the norm, it was not unheard of for a buyer to be paying for 3, 4, 5 pre-inspections before they got a house under contract because they wanted a pre-inspection done on every home they made an offer on. Well, if they don't get the first home they make an offer on, guess what? The next home they want to make an offer on, maybe they're going to want a pre-inspection on that one. So it can get expensive. Just FYI. The other thing is making sure you use showing time, because it's your responsibility when a pre-inspection is done. Once you get the seller's permission, it's your responsibility to make sure you block out enough time on showing time to give your inspector the opportunity to go in and do the pre-inspection on the property. And of course, your buyers are welcome to be there or be there for the end of it for the summary. And they're going to get the written report in advance to making the offer. So this one was also new as of March 21st, lots of form changes. By the way, we've got more form changes coming in October of this year. I think it's October 3rd. They update and change these. We'll be teaching another series of those when they do. But for right now, these are the ones that you're going to use. In anticipation of the negotiation of a purchase and sale agreement between them, this is between the seller and the buyer, for the real property located at, you simply plug in the address, the city, the state, and the zip, that the seller agrees the buyer may inspect the property at a mutually convenient time and date. Buyer's inspection may include a buyer's option, all the goodies, structural, mechanical, general condition of the improvements, compliance with building and zoning, inspection of the property for hazardous materials, pest inspection, soils, everything else. So, bonus points. Who can perform a pre-inspection? There's two answers. Who can perform a pre-inspection on a property?
Licensed inspectors only.
And what's the second one, Jim?
Oh, sorry. Hit me twice.
That's all right.
Buyer himself.
The buyer himself. The
Or-
buyer, him or herself, right?
Yep.
That doesn't mean the buyer's dad. That doesn't mean the buyer's uncle, although they can bring them. I mean, they're technically not supposed to, but they do. But anyway, so the buyer can perform their own inspection. Maybe that buyer's a contractor looking to do a flip on a property, right? They can go in and do their own inspection. Why would you want a pre-inspection done? Because they're going to be rooting around. They're going to be doing more than just opening closets when they do an inspection. They're probably going to be crawling under the house. They're going to be crawling into the crawl space. You don't have the right to do that when you're just showing a property. So remember that the buyer themselves can do the inspection, or a licensed, Jim's right, a licensed Washington State home inspector. Those are the two parties that can do it. Oh, buyer's obligations. So they need to be, again, ordered by the buyer, performed by an inspector of the buyer's choice, and completed at the buyer's expense. And this is kind of like a regular inspection. They're not going to alter it without obtaining the seller's permission. Here's an example. They're wondering if that popcorn ceiling has asbestos in it. You can't go scraping chunks of the asbestos ceiling for that kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Without the seller's permission. So if you get the seller's permission, you can scrape some of that popcorn ceiling off and send it in for an asbestos inspection. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, but if you don't, we've had it where some people actually take out a pocket knife and scrape some of the paint off of the windowsill to go out and do their lead-based paint. That's modifying, boys and girls. That's you cannot do any of that without your seller's permission. I've seen holes knocked in walls to see where plumbing pipes lead. We've seen a lot of things. Anyway, if they do, the buyer, so let's say they get permission, then the buyer still has to restore the property and all the improvements to the same condition they were in prior to the inspection. And the buyer's responsible for damages. Sewer inspection. May or may not include an inspection of the sewer system. So here's your sewer scope and it defaults to May. Talks about oil storage tanks. You can get those inspected in advance. Parties understand the agreement does not obligate the buyer or seller to consider or enter into a purchase and sale agreement. Just because a seller and a buyer agree to a pre-inspection, they are under absolutely no obligation, the buyer, to make an offer on the property. It kind of goes without saying, but it's spelled out in here. That inspection report may come back and be so horrible that buyer says, "Oh my God, I don't have it in me to go do that." So that is. Oh, you know what? I did it again. So here we go. Here's your buyer's obligations. Here's your sewer inspection. Here's your oil storage tanks. And that is all under your pre-inspection agreement. All right. So
One thing I'd like to say is if your buyers are nervous about getting contractors instead of just the inspector, because most inspectors will give you a kind of a general, I think so, kind of so, answers on some of them. The inspection addendum will open the door so you can bring contractors in. To start with, you can't do it until you get the inspection done. But once the inspection is done, then that opens the door to bring in Larry Moe and Curly Construction and get all your bids for the thing. So, which is going to cost you money in this market. There's not a contractor that'll go do a freebie anymore.
This is true, because contractors are, hard to find. Good ones are hard to find. All right, so we are going to move on. I am going to remember to screen share this time, and we are going to do the infamous 35R. This gets more people in hot water, and I probably get more phone calls on this form than I do on any other form. Why? Because people are terrified that they're going to provide more than they're supposed to the seller with their inspection request or their modification or repair request, and end up inadvertently waiving this on behalf of their buyer. I get calls about this at least once a week. So remind me again, what can I include with my request on my 35R? Can I send over this? Can I send over that? Am I going to get in trouble if I do that? The answer is the only thing you can send in is a cut and paste of the exact request off of the inspection report, calling out the work that needs to be performed. So what if there's more than one item? You're going to do more than one cut and paste. Where are you going to put them? Probably on a blank form addendum, which is a form 34, is going to be as good a place. You can put them on a Word document if you want to, as long as it's incorporated with all this verbiage. So a 34 would probably be the best. So here we go. Buyer's response or request for repairs or modification. This is after you're under contract. We'll throw out that pre-inspection. We're done with that for now. Going back to a regular inspection that's going on during the contract term. Get an inspection done. The buyer says, oops, there's some issues with the property. I really don't have the money to correct all these. Or in the case, we had one the other day, and the people are relocating from out of area. They're moving like the week before school starts. And they said, we don't want to be getting the kids ready to go to school and overseeing a bunch of repairs after closing. So we want the seller to take care of these before we close. And that was their argument. It's a good one. So we've got the 4 choices. Buyer approves it and it's deemed satisfied. So what does this little asterisk mean? This little asterisk means that this is a notice which requires only one buyer or one seller's signature. So a notice, it can be husband, wife, significant other, partner, mom, dad, whoever else is in it. So it only requires one person's signature as a party to the contract, and one person's signature on behalf of the seller. Plan B. Buyer's inspection of the property is disapproved. The agreement is terminated. The earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Again, it only takes one signature for that. Is this enough to get the earnest money back from the title company? And the answer to that is no. You are still going to need a Form 50. We'll look at that in a minute. I forgot to pull it up. A Form 50 with a request for an earnest money disbursement, because the title company is going to want written instructions on how that earnest money is to be dispersed. You'd think, and I think the intent of this was that this was going to be enough to get the buyer's earnest money back. It is not in most cases. Some title companies will, but most will not. So everything's great. Everything's horrible. Buyer gets notice of an additional inspection. Well, it's pretty good, but I want to take a little closer look. Here's the words. The inspector's recommendation is attached. It doesn't talk about any other recommendations. This is that the inspector recommends that a roofer go look at the property, that a engineer look at the foundation, that whatever it is. So you have to attach the inspector's recommendation. Time for buyer's response is extended as provided in paragraph 5 of 35. Well, follow the bunny trail. Let's go back to paragraph 5. Additional time for inspections. If the inspector so recommends, they get an additional time, which is 5 days. So a lot of times what happens is people are looking for the timeframes on this inspection 35R. The timeframes are not on here. The timeframes are on the initial document, which is the inspection itself, which is the Form 35. So if you're looking for how many days you've got, always go back to the original form, always go back to your 35. So if you want the additional 5 days triggered or whatever you've agreed to, this is the form that you do it with. So you're going to check this box. You note that there's one little asterisk over here, which means that only one signature is required. And because it's a notice, you don't need a seller's agreement. You're simply notifying the seller that you're triggering an additional 5-day period that they've already agreed to in their inspection. Or buyer requests the following modifications or repairs. And if the seller agrees, then everything is great and it's deemed satisfied. Oh, look, we got 2 little asterisks. Let's go down and see what that means. This is not a notice and requires all buyers and sellers' signatures. If you simply take the time to slow down and read the form, it will walk you through a lot of these things. If the buyer provides any form of the inspection without seller's prior written consent or is required by paragraph 5 of Form 35, the inspection contingency shall be conclusively deemed waived. Again, so if you need time for additional inspections, you're going to include it. Anything else, you're not. You can write it out, you can do a cut and paste, but you are not going to include the inspection itself, period. Otherwise, you're going to waive. I don't know why, frankly, they made this so onerous, but they did. You can see that there's, I think I've covered 3 different places in this, that if you miss a time frame, you're screwed. Your buyer, this whole inspection and the ability to negotiate for repairs goes away. So you can see why that would be such a big deal for your client. Back to screen share. Here we go. Seller's response. Seller agrees to all modifications. Life is great. Proceed to closing. Now that does take both seller signatures or all seller signatures. Or seller agrees to correct only the following, described below or on the attached pages, again, using probably a Form 34. I'll do 1, 3, and 5, but I'm not going to do 2 and 4. Both parties need to sign this, both sellers need to sign this, and it goes back to the buyer. Or seller rejects all proposals by buyer. One signature and the seller says, nope, I'm not going to do a thing. Now, let me ask a question. So if the seller comes back and says, nope, I'm not going to do anything, because I get this question a lot, does the buyer have the right to walk away? Does the buyer have the right to walk away if the seller rejects everything? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Buyer have the right to walk away? Yep, they do. You're right, Sierra. But does the buyer have the right to say, oh, well, no harm, no foul. I've asked. I want to buy the house anyway, and move forward? Some sellers think that by rejecting all proposals, the deal dies and they don't have to proceed on. And that's not true. If the seller rejects all proposals, the buyer still has the right to come back and say, okay, oh, well, I'm going to buy it anyway. So remember this, there is no harm in having a buyer request proposals based on an inspection. The worst case that can happen is the seller can say no, and they can say, oh, well, and go to proceed to closing anyway. That's the worst case. Seller may agree to something. That's a better case. The seller may agree to everything. That's a best case. But you're not going to hurt anything by asking. Some buyers are afraid to ask because they're afraid that if they ask and the seller says no, it terminates the contract. It does not terminate the contract. Okay? The buyer always has the right to agree to proceed forward. So Seller rejects all proposals. Seller rejects all proposals, but proposes the following alternative modifications or repairs. So maybe the buyer wants a bunch of work done on the property. They want a new roof. They want a new paint job. They want all the windows replaced. And the seller comes back and says, you know what? I'm not going to do any of that, but I am going to do this. I'm going to give you a $25,000 credit at closing. So that's an alternative modification or repair. Or maybe the buyer wants a brand new roof and the seller says, I'm not going to put a new roof on, but I'll certainly go patch and repair the one that is on there currently. And I'll guarantee that it's got a 5-year remaining life. By the way, 5 years is kind of the bellwether term, I guess you'd say, for remaining life in a roof for a lender and for an inspector that has got 5 years of remaining useful life. That's kind of the trigger that they look for. And then here's that third reply, buyer's reply to seller's response. Now, if the buyer satisfies and signs off and delivers it to the seller, you're done. If the buyer asks for modifications and the seller agrees to the modifications and signs it, you're done. If there's any other combination, you're going to have to go all the way through this form. So if the buyer approves, one signature from the buyer. If the buyer requests something and the seller agrees to it, the buyer signs, the seller signs, and you're done. But if the buyer requests something and the seller proposes a modified agreement, then you're going into the third phase. But remember what I said back over here on the Form 35? That attention buyer, these time periods for negotiating shall not repeat. What happens if you get down here to the bottom and you're still negotiating? Well, they can't repeat. You can't go back to part one and start all over again. And oh, by the way, you've got 3 days. Remember, back in the 35, the seller has 3 days to reply and then the buyer has 3 days to reply. So the buyer can accept the seller's response and agrees to proceed to closing. And that response might be £, I'm not doing anything. Up here, seller rejects all proposal. The buyer can say, okay, that's fine, no problem. We asked anyway. We're going to accept your response and proceed to closing. All right. Or the buyer rejects the response, disapproves the inspection, the agreement's terminated. Nope, you know what? We're too far apart. I'm leery to take this on. The seller doesn't want to give any concessions. I'm out. Or, and here's where it gets tricky. Buyer rejects seller's response, but offers the alternative proposal for modification and repair. So buyer wants a new roof. Seller says, nope, I'll go back in and I'll do some patching. And the buyer comes back and says, nope, that's not going to work. How about you just give me a $10,000 credit at closing and I'll take care of my own roof. Buyer acknowledges the inspection contingency will be waived unless you reach written agreement within those 3 days. Remember those 3 days. So if you are on day 3 and it's 8:30 at night and you haven't heard from the seller about your request and you're not prepared to buy unless you get something from the seller, what do you as the buyer broker have to do? You've heard nothing from the seller. You asked for a new roof. The seller came back and said, I'll patch it. And the buyer comes back and says, nope, the patch won't work, but I'll take $10,000. The time starts clicking. You go through 3 days. You're at 8:30 at night, 9 o'clock deadline. What do you have to do to protect your buyer at that point? What do you have to do? Because if you go past 9 o'clock, what happens?
You're under contract,
You waive it.
right?
You waive it.
Do you send a rescission?
You have to send a rescission. You have to send a cancellation of the contract to protect your buyer. As weird as that sounds, the only way you're going to protect your buyer if the seller stays silent and the time frame is ticking on those 3 days is to kill the contract. Because if you don't kill the contract, the other alternative is that the buyer waives the right to ask for anything on this, and they have to go forward to close. So you either have to kill it, or you have to be okay with going forward and the seller giving you no concession. So the seller not answering is like the seller saying no. Ollie, you're right, terminate. Tessa, I know you're trying to jump in, come on.
Oh, sorry. I took a phone call. I don't know. What did you, you were on mute. What was the question?
You're not paying attention to me, I'm crushed.
No, I had to take the call.
We were
Yeah.
talking about when you reach the end of the 3 cycle negotiating on the 35R and the buyer has asked for something else and you haven't heard from the seller for 3 days and it's 8:30 on the last day, the fact that you have to kill the contract to protect your buyer. You have to. The other thing you can do is when you send in this proposal is you can say that the buyer proposes a $10,000 credit at closing. In the event the seller does not agree, this agreement shall terminate and earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. I don't recommend that without talking to somebody like me who knows how to do verbiage, because if you word it wrong, if you're going to do a 34 and write your own scripts, you're going to be held to the standard of care of an attorney. So if this ends up in court and they pull out your 34 and say, hey, Danny, I'm reading this and this makes absolutely no sense to me. Who in the hell wrote this? And you have to kind of go, ugh, I did. If you're going to write it, you have to write it so that it's understandable, it's complete, and you will be held to the standard of care of an attorney. So just be really careful anytime you're going to play attorney and draft a form 34, let somebody else lay eyes on it. But anyway, so the inspection addendum can be kind of a tricky one, right? You got all kinds of time frames you got to deal with. You're juggling balls. You're getting inspectors out there. You're asking for repairs. You're negotiating repairs. This is why I say, when people say, I've already found a house to buy, I just want you to write it up. My answer to them is, finding the house and getting the agreed upon sales price is almost the easy part. The hard part is when you get into the contract and you continue your negotiations over things like this, over things like inspections. What if your appraisal comes in low? What if the financing comes in disapproved and you have to change lenders? That's where you guys shine. That's why I say that that's where you earn your commission. Finding the house is the easy part. That is as much on your buyer as it is on you. They have access to every single tool that you do. They can go on the internet, they can look on Remax, they can look on Zillow, they can go wherever. They can knock on their next door neighbor's door. Finding the house is the easy part. The negotiating is where you shine. So you need to get comfortable with negotiating. If I was going to recommend any class to take, it would be something on negotiating. And by the way, negotiating is not splitting the difference. Those of us that took there's a certified negotiation expert class out there, and it's a 2-day excellent class that several of us have taken. And it basically teaches you how to negotiate, because most people are not comfortable negotiating. They're just not. And that includes real estate brokers. So we are now all the way through. So what has to happen? Usually at this case, my recommendation is you pick up the phone if you're representing a buyer and you call the listing broker and you go to work and you say, look, can you call your sellers and see if maybe they'll come up a little bit? And I'll talk to my buyers and see if they can come down a little bit and see if we can get to mutual before this 3-day clock runs out. Because if this 3-day clock runs out, you don't have any choice other than to protect your buyer if they truly don't want to go forward, than to kill the contract. And you've just done all that work for nothing. So we've got that. Okay. I'm going to jump over one last thing. I'm going to cover this pretty quickly. This is called a septic addendum to a purchase and sale agreement. And a caveat, several counties, Skagit County, King County, a lot of counties have their own addendum that goes with this. So be sure and review your forms. Today, I'm just going to review the generic septic addendum 22S. And it's called an on-site sewage system. Very, very common in all of our counties, Whatcom, Skagit, Island, Snohomish, And if you don't know much about them, it's probably time to learn. So it talks about the addendum supersedes any other provisions of this agreement related to the on-site OSS, except for the provisions of a county-specific septic addendum. So the first question they ask, is it private or shared? I will say that probably 95% of them are private. It's kind of rare to have a shared septic, although it's not unheard of. And that's basically where two properties share a septic system and share a septic drain field. Seller represents, I'm under seller's representation, they're representing that to the best of their knowledge that the septic system doesn't require repair other than pumping and normal maintenance. It doesn't violate any applicable laws, and it has no material defects. But here's the part, it says to the best of their knowledge. Seller may say, hell, that thing's worked fine for 15 years. I've never had it pumped. I've never touched it. Does that mean that it's working in good working order? Nope, it does not. So the seller also has an obligation to deliver to the buyer the maintenance records, if they're available, within 10 days of mutual acceptance. Sometimes they have them. It's more common they do not. So you're not going to really rely on that. I've also been asked what happens if at the end of 10 days, the seller hasn't delivered them. They say they've got them, but they haven't given you anything. There's not really a lot you can do. That's kind of an open-ended, in my opinion, kind of poorly worded little paragraph there, because if they deliver them to you on day 11, there's not a whole lot you can do. County or city inspection requirements. Seller, oh, wait a minute here. Maintenance, oh, county or city, here we go. Seller shall comply with all local regulations or ordinance that may require seller to conduct. So there are counties like Skagit that do require the seller to pump the system and conduct an inspection prior to closing. The seller shall have it inspected, and if the inspector determines necessary, pumped. So if it's been pumped within 12 months prior to closing, 12 months of mutual acceptance, then the seller just has to provide the evidence that it was pumped, and they're not going to go out and pump it again. But just because it's been pumped doesn't mean it's been inspected. They're two separate things. A pump, they just come, they hook up their truck and they pump it. Inspected means they're going to inspect the mechanics of the system and make sure that those are working as well. So if they've had it pumped and if they provide the buyer written evidence, including the inspection report, then the seller has no obligation to inspect and pump. Maybe they had them both done. A lot of smart listing agents actually have this done at the time they list the property. So be sure and check your additional forms when you're writing an offer to see if maybe that's already there. Bonus points for the listing broker if it is. And buyer's right to attend an inspection. So let's say you're asking for a septic inspection and you call Baker Septic to get out there. The buyer can actually go and attend the inspection if they want to. If that box is checked, it has to be checked, and the seller hasn't already done the inspection, then the buyer has the right to observe the inspection. The agreement's conditioned on buyer's subjective satisfaction of the inspection. The contingency shall be deemed waived unless buyer gives notice of disapproval within 5 days after receipt of the inspection report. If they give timely notice of disapproval, the agreement shall terminate. The earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. It's pretty straightforward. It's really pretty straightforward. This would run in conjunction with your inspection. It would run in conjunction with your financing. So now you not only have your inspector's hat on and your lender's hat on, now you have your septic hat on. And a lot of times if there's a septic system, in conjunction with that, there is going to be a well. Very common. So, a couple of different kinds of wells, private and shared. So this is where you would fill in if there's 1 connection, 10 connections, whatever. Seller represents that to the best of their knowledge. And again, there's that subjective to the, oops, wait a minute. I'm sharing here. So seller represents that, except as explained below, to the best of their knowledge, the well and water supply serving the property provided an adequate supply of water. It's not contaminated. It's in compliance with all local, state, federal laws, standards, and has no other material defects. Well, that's a nice paragraph, but the fact that it says to the best of their knowledge does not give the buyer the reassurance that they should be able to rely on this statement. Again, remember my story, it's buyer beware. I would always have a well inspection done. I just would. Number one, I want to make sure that it doesn't go dry in the summer, that it has an adequate supply. How can you find that out? Sometimes knocking on the neighbor's door is a good way. Just have a conversation with them, because trust me, that nosy neighbor is going to be over after closing and go, so what are you going to do every July and August when this well runs dry? Oh, the seller didn't tell you that they have to truck water in 2 months out of the year, sometimes 3. Then it turns into a mess. Yes, the seller is supposed to tell you that. Or maybe it was just the seller living there as a single person and you're moving in with a family of 8. So you're going to use a heck of a lot more water. And it does go dry in July and August. Who knows?
Oh, Lori,
Yep, go ahead.
one other thing is if you should, if you can, get your hands on the well report. It'll give you the basic information on how many gallons per minute came out of the well when they dug it. And if the well is more than 10 years old, the odds are you're probably going to have chloroform issues. Those are simple. People freak out, but it's really simple. You chlorinize the well and with pool chlorine, if you're going to do it yourself, or have a Culligan dealer or somebody like that go and do it. And then you'll get, because the more than likely the bank's going to want some kind of water test anyhow. So
and one other caveat here. So where would you go get that well report, Jim?
I usually call the well drillers, and on each one of the well heads nowadays has an Department of Ecology sticker on it, and it's a metal bracket. It's not a little sticker. And you can take that number and go to Department of Ecology. You can look it up, or sometimes they have the well reports, sometimes they don't. The health department in the area will have copies of those. And if they don't, that just means it's really old. So you're going to have a well drill, same thing, do a flow test and a bacterial test.
Well, and the other thing is sometimes those are available. Are they online? Or are they not? Sometimes.
Should be.
Yeah, they definitely could be. Now, one other caveat here, I'm going to tell you another little story and then I'm going to let you go. Potability or drinkability of a water. One thing not to freak out about is there are minerals and things in our water around here. Like, for example, out on Lummi Island, arsenic is very prevalent in water on Lummi. People freak out. And basically, you can have a well purification system added onto the well if there isn't one already from somebody like Culligan that will take all of those impurities out of the water. But bear in mind, there is more than one kind of potability test. There's a basic one, which is the cheap one, which is a lot of people make the mistake of going for, which is just going to cover the major items. But then there's a little bit more expensive one. And by more expensive, I mean, it might be another $75. But it's going to look for a lot of these other minerals and things in the water that you may not be aware of, including salt or saline. Always go for the more expensive one. Never go for the cheap one. Ever, 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 ever. Because I'll tell you what will happen. You'll go for the cheap one. The deal will close. The buyer, for whatever reason, is going to have an issue with their water. They're going to find out that, gee, we didn't do the right kind of test. If we would have spent $75 more, we would have found out about this and we could have negotiated with the seller, but now we're closed and we're screwed. So I think I'll call Gavin and tell him I need this fixed because I have salt in my well. And Gavin is going to go, well, hell, how was I supposed to know? It's our job to direct traffic in these transactions, not to go investigate, but to direct traffic and make sure our clients know where to go investigate all of these different things. If you remember nothing else today, always get the better potable test for wealth.
Yes.
Oh,
And I just did one not too long ago, about 6 months ago. The bacterial with the solids, which is the full-blown water test, is $400. So we just paid that. So, and it's well worth it because that test after you get it is also good for 1 year. If you ever get a building permit, you'll need those water tests in order to get an addition permit or a garage permit. They're going to want to see that. And if you don't have it, you're going to pay for it in the future. So
perfect. And we couldn't have a better guest on this morning than Jim, because that's his specialty, is vacant land, raw land, development land, that kind of a thing. It's what he does. I should actually have him teach this morning. So we've covered a lot. I'm going to stop us pretty much right on time. We covered inspections. We covered inspection waiver. We covered pre-inspection. We covered inspection response. We covered septics. We covered wells. We covered a lot. But you can see how, again, just taking 90 minutes to go through these forms and taking a really deep dive, hopefully now you feel more comfortable. So again, your homework assignment is to go back to these forms. I think I attached them all on the meeting reminder, and read them. Read them again while they're fresh in your mind. Read them again while you just spent 90 minutes with me going through them, and practice filling them out. Practice actually filling in the blanks. And pretend that you've got negotiations going on, and pretend you have to do a cut and paste off of a home inspection. Number one, do you have the software to be able to do that? I use something called TechSmith that I love. TechSmith, TechSmith. It's free. And it's probably the easiest. You can do a cut and paste. You can shoot a video. There's a lot of things you can do with it. It's free. But if you don't have something to do a cut and paste, get it, because you're going to need it. Practice dropping it onto a blank form 34. Make sure you can do it. Now is the time to practice all these things, not when you've got a client sitting in front of you and you're going, oh yeah, I guess I need to do a cut and paste and I don't have the software for that. So we are going to take, I think, a little break on our classes because, yep, Lisa and I are going to Nashville to a broker owner conference. We will be resuming these on Friday, August 19th. And then they will go the next week, Monday, and I don't know why I didn't. Okay, I think I'm going to move that and say Monday and Wednesday, the 22nd, 24th. And we'll go from there. Don't forget, all of these are all recorded. They're up on our group Facebook page. If you haven't visited there, I suggest you go take a look. Go back, review the forms while they're fresh in your brain. And yeah, have a great day. Those, by the way, there is a RE/MAX Whatcom and Gateway is welcome. There is a business meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'm going to be sending out a reminder. It's always fun. That's where we do haves and wants. So we'll see you then. Have a
Awesome.
great
Thank
day.
you.
Bye. Thanks for joining me.